there were times when the humanity sort of just burst forth en masse, spontaneously. None more famous, maybe overrated, some people say, but I don't see how it can be overrated, than what happened, on Christmas Eve, 1914, especially on the Western Front. The conditions are horrible. It's freezing. Your feet are stuck in gruel, mud, water that you think can't get any worse, and then it all freezes and you're stuck out there in the cold. And then all of a sudden, the people on the Western Front see something relatively unbelievable in a conflict where you have shells going on every second, snipers picking off anyone who raises his head above the trench, and then all of a sudden, soldiers reported hearing singing and seeing weird colored lights. The colored lights were often coming from the German trenches. Soldier Julius Kotchen was in one of those trenches, opposite the French, saying the conditions were horrible, but on Christmas Eve, this is what happened. Quote, "Christmas in the trenches. It was bitterly cold. We had procured a pine tree, for there were no fir trees to be had. We had decorated the tree with candles and cookies. We had imitated the snow with wadding. Christmas trees were burning everywhere in the trenches, and at midnight, all the trees were lifted onto the parapet with their burning candles, and along the whole line, German soldiers began to sing Christmas songs in chorus. 'O thou blissful, O thou joyous, mercy-bringing Christmas time.' Hundreds of men," he writes, "were singing the song in that fearful wood. Not a shot was fired. The French had ceased firing along the whole line. That night I was with a company that was only 5 paces away from the enemy. The Christmas candles were burning brightly and were renewed again and again. For the first time, we heard no shots. From everywhere throughout the forest," he writes, "one could hear powerful carols come floating over, 'Peace on earth,' and such. The French," he says, "left their trenches and stood on the parapet without any fear. There they stood, quite overpowered by emotion, and all of them with cap in hand. We, too, had issued from our trenches. We exchanged gifts with the French, chocolate, cigarettes, etc. They were all laughing, and so were we. Why, we did not know. Then everybody went back to his trench, and incessantly the carol resounded, ever more solemnly, ever more longingly, 'O thou blissful.'" End quote. Private William Quinton, in the trenches on Christmas Eve on the British side, wrote about a similar situation farther down the line. Quote, "All around us lay about 3 inches of snow, a typical picture postcard Christmas. Things were very quiet. That peace and goodwill to all men feeling seemed to be in the air. We could hear the Germans still strafing up Ypres way, but the next night, Christmas Eve, even up there was much quieter. Something in the direction of the German lines caused us to rub our eyes and look again. Here and there, showing just above their parapet, we could see very faintly what looked like very small colored lights. What was this? Was it some prearranged signal and the forerunner of an attack? Or was it to make us curious and thus expose ourselves to a sudden raking of machine gun fire? We were very suspicious, and we were discussing the strange move of the enemy when something even stranger happened. The Germans were actually singing. Not very loud, but there was no mistaking it. We began to get interested. The enemy, at least, were going to enjoy themselves as much as the circumstances would permit. Suddenly, across the snow-clad no-man's land, a strong, clear voice rang out, singing the opening lines of Annie Laurie. It was sung in perfect English, and we were spellbound. No other sound but this unknown singer's voice. To us it seemed like the war had suddenly stopped to listen to this song from one of the enemy. Not a sound from friend or foe, and as the last notes died away, a spontaneous outburst of clapping arose from our trenches. Encore! Good old Fritz! End quote. All along the line, the two sides would have this interesting moment where they kind of began to emerge from the trenches little by little. A place where they couldn't stick a finger up without having it shot off just hours before. And everybody must have been so incredibly brave to try. But one side would raise themselves up a little bit, and the other side would raise themselves up a little bit more, until both sides, in this hellish environment where nobody could go anywhere near, the open air, were standing apart from each other, gazing right at the enemy in no man's land on Christmas. Private William Quinton again wrote, quote, "As daylight crept in, we were surprised to see the Germans waist high out of their trenches, gazing across at us with impunity. Imagine the position. Whereas yesterday the mere sight of a bit of field gray uniform would have caused a dozen British rifles to crack, here was the enemy, in full view of us, gazing serenely across no man's land at us, and we at him. To us in the front line, the whole world had changed. We could take stock of our surroundings at our leisure. At 9 o'clock precisely, the German burying party climbed from the trenches, shovels and picks on their shoulders. They advanced about 10 yards in our direction and waited expectantly. A word from our company officer, and our party were soon out. The officers looked on, apparently conversing. The digging party soon lost interest in their task and before long were busy fraternizing. Cigarettes were being exchanged, and they seemed to be enjoying themselves immensely. Needless to say, before very long, we in the trenches were soon out on top, sauntering about the snow, but keeping this side of our wire entanglements. Likewise the Germans. For the whole of that day, and for many days to come, friend and foe mixed freely out on no man's land. Except for the fact that a few of the enemy could speak a little English, we found the language difficulty a bar to conversation, but we made do with signs and gestures. I remember distinctly a German holding out an open box of chocolates for me to take one. The Germans wanted to play us a football match on no man's land, but our officers would not allow it." End quote. There are reports, though, of British and German troops engaging in soccer matches up and down the line. It was an amazing, spontaneous outburst of humanity.